Okay, so the Arctic Research Plan came out in December, and as I mentioned, it is a broad, high-level plan, and that's different than previous plans have been, which many of you might remember. There were performance elements that got really detailed about what the different activities that IARPC was doing. And this time we have adjusted. So we are going to have biennial implementation plans, and this will allow for implementation to be much more flexible moving forward so that we can address issues that emerge on a shorter time frame than the 5-year plan allows. And these 2-year implementation plans will be more granular. They'll provide specific and tangible objectives and deliverables. And this planning structure will also provide more opportunities for Arctic researchers and residents to drive the work that IARPC does. So this is where we are right now. We are in the process of getting input for the implementation of the Arctic Research Plan, getting down into the details of what activities IARPC will be doing for the next 2 years. So it's an exciting time to be involved in IARPC, and we think that this new approach is a big step in being more responsive to emerging research questions and to engage new people from across federal agencies as well as outside of the federal government. And I'm going to, I guess I'll just briefly touch on this. Gives a kind of a schematic for how collaboration teams like this one fit into the overall structure of IARPC. And you see that the collaboration teams and foundational activity teams are indicated at the bottom, and feeding into the priority areas. This schematic might be a little outdated. I meant to skip over it, but it gives you kind of a sense of who the players are as well. And this is the timeline. So we are now in the 3rd section of this, where we are at a public meeting to solicit ideas on topics to be pursued within each priority area. And then that will move into a drafting phase in April and May, with the implementation, biennial implementation coming out at the end of this year. Here are some the definitions for objectives and deliverables that will be included in the Arctic Research Plan. So objectives are specific research actions that advance the goals, and I'll run through the goals in a moment. Sorry. And deliverables are tangible, measurable, and easily communicated research products that demonstrate progress made towards satisfying the objectives and the goals, and are made available to relevant decision makers and partners. Deliverables could also include achievements resulting from the establishment of new relationships. So that's just hopefully to give you a better sense of what we mean by objective and deliverable. And so, as I mentioned, the new plan is divided into 4 priority areas, and I will now go through each of those priority areas, their goals, and as well as the very preliminary draft objectives that the teams associated with these priority areas are proposing. And then hopefully that will create some good discussion for us here today. So this is priority area 1, community resilience and health. And the goal of this priority area is to improve community resilience and well-being by strengthening research and developing tools to increase understanding of interdependent social, natural, and built systems in the Arctic. And these are the preliminary draft objectives that have been identified by the transition team associated with this priority area, and they are to evaluate threats to food safety and security and develop solutions to improve availability of nutritious subsistence and market-based foods, support physical and mental health of Arctic residents through research on public health needs, disparities, and delivery, support integrative approaches to cultural health, wellness, and resilience, and then to promote research on access to safe, reliable infrastructure with relevance to human health and well-being. The second priority area is Arctic systems interactions, and I am very sorry they have decided to plow the street right outside my house. So there's nothing I can do about it, but if it's too distracting, just let me know. Maybe I can move rooms. Okay, so the second priority area, Arctic systems interactions, the goal is to enhance our ability to observe, understand, predict, and project the Arctic's dynamic interconnected systems and their links to the Earth systems. So the preliminary goals that have been identified, preliminary objectives that have been identified are Arctic ecosystems, change, research. This is the second one. I'm reading them a bit out of order, but this could include the role of the Arctic in the global carbon cycle, for example, as sources and sinks of carbon dioxide and methane, also marine and terrestrial ecosystems changes, and the impacts of the Arctic ecosystems change and the effects on human and health food security. The first one, Arctic amplification and mid-latitude connections, both in terms of the atmosphere and the ocean. For example, the implications of Arctic change on ocean circulation, and then the interaction among the ice, atmosphere, ocean, and land. For example, the role of sea ice in the ocean ecosystem health, as well as food security. Priority area 3, sustainable economies and livelihoods. The goal here is to observe, understand, and understand the Arctic's natural, social, and built systems to promote sustainable economies and livelihoods. The preliminary, some of the research that they are considering, ecosystems health assessments, models, and forecasts, community economic priorities, to map and leverage available capacity, and to understand community and regional intersections and dependencies. Okay, thanks, Betsy. And then finally, we have priority area 4, risk management and hazard mitigation. And the goal is to secure and improve quality of life through research that promotes an understanding of disaster, risk exposure, sensitivity to hazards, and adaptive capacity. And here are the preliminary draft research questions that this team is considering. So what data, tools, and technologies are needed to increase understanding of Arctic ecosystems to improve hazard mitigation and adaptive capacity? How can we better share this data and information? How do we increase our understanding of how environmental change will affect current and future adaptive capacity and resiliency? And finally, how can we better understand how hazards, both acute and chronic, will affect critical infrastructure and vice versa? So with that, I am going to pause the screen share. I do have some questions that I can drop in the chat that might help the discussion, but I'm happy to answer questions as well. I guess the main question that the coastal resilience team has for you all, I have dropped in the chat, and that is what are the most important research questions to be answered in the next 2 years from a coastal resilience perspective, since that's the team that we are kind of looking at this through that lens today. And I'll hand it back over to the team leaders. If you want to direct the discussion in any way, please feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. That was great, but there was a lot of information in that, and so I think the first thing is that there's a little bit to digest there in terms of how we sort of move forward and how we approach. As you saw in one of the early slides, one of the purposes or one of the ways that the coastal resilience team fits into this larger planning effort is to provide some information to those priority area transition teams to give them information that they'll need for writing and moving forward with that plan. So with that kind of sort of thinking cap on, I guess the first thing is, are there any questions in relation to sort of the bigger picture of what they're trying to accomplish that anybody has? And I'll give a little bit of time for people to think here. I'm not afraid of silence. Yeah, go ahead, Rami. I see you take your mute off.
Well, I was going to ask if anyone could help give me an impression on some of the previous coastal resilience meetings, and specifically talking about interdisciplinarity and the relationships that we have, and when we're looking at the data, when we're looking at having the relationships with people in other disciplines, with people with perhaps other demands with their agencies or personal lives and so forth. The webinars before, the conversations with the team before last July, and I guess I'm trying to remember, was it August or October, that the other team meeting was, in talking about how to process and how to talk about these kinds of things. If anyone could help catch me up a little bit more with that, that would be terrifically appreciated, because that in a sense is kind of what I understand is the question being asked right now is in a sense like, well, I guess I'll just leave that at that for just now.
Yeah, Meredith, do you want to weigh in on that, or?
Sure. Yeah. Rami is referring to I believe is a series of 2 meetings that happened at the middle and end of last year that the coastal resilience team under the previous leadership hosted around interdisciplinary collaboration. And those meetings were a helpful forum to kind of discuss what some of the issues are around interdisciplinary collaboration in the coastal resilience space, which is inherently interdisciplinary. And so the meetings provided a forum for that. And I agree with Rami that the new Arctic research plan is much more interdisciplinary than the previous plans have been. The coastal resilience team has always been a team that's kind of functioned in that space, but many of the other teams are more disciplinary, have been more disciplinary focused, and so it's going to be a challenge, a good challenge for IARPC over the next year to transition into a more interdisciplinary structure.
Hi folks, sorry. My name is Jocelyn Fenton with the Denali Commission, and we had an overlapping meeting, so couldn't join until the half hour. And I don't think we've not attended a Coastal Resilience Collaboration Team meeting before. We may have attended one before, but with all the IARPC other meetings going on, I'm losing track of meetings and whatnot. And I'm hoping that my colleague Liza Mack will be joining me. She's the program manager for the Village Infrastructure Protection Program. I'm our director of programs here at the Commission, and it'd be great to know, whether this is something we should participate in, or, if it makes sense for us to join these monthly meetings. We just started attending the IARPC staff meetings. Yeah, so here we are.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for joining, Jocelyn. We are right now kind of discussing the implementation, the biennial implementation plan, and ways that the Coastal Resilience team may be able to provide input to that plan. And there's been, and so what Rami had just brought up was that there's been some past discussions that have taken place about the interdisciplinary, just kind of the interdisciplinary nature of the coastal issues in general, as well as coastal resilience as a whole. And how can, I think, Rami, and if I get this wrong, absolutely correct me, but I think that through those discussions, there were potentially suggestions that could have been that could be used for feeding into the current implementation plan, as well. I'll just leave it at that. That could feed into the current implementation plan, and some things that may be really valuable, that it might almost that it might be worth going back into those meetings and looking and see what suggestions were. Am I taking that too far, or is that kind of where you were going with that?
Well, I guess, Meredith, do you feel like that's a fair summary of what those were? I think my perspective is that it is, but I'm biased because interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary learning, I mean, that was the title of my master's from UAF in 2000. So how we relate with science, how we communicate truth and knowledge, especially through dynamic times. And that has been an aspect of my practice and study through all these years. So I'm a little biased in that respect, that I do think that the conversations that happened in the previous webinars, but also the phenomena of this team, is dynamic enough that it forces each of us, in a sense, each discipline, to go ahead and breathe through the phenomena because of the dynamics that are happening so much. And I don't mean to be, meta and public philosopher, kind of thing, but part of what we're dealing with are the spiritual and the cultural and the historical connections of all these things that are really old and really complex. So as we find ourselves trying to figure out the work to do, the questions to ask, the right data to look at, how to measure things, how to attribute credit or stories, or how to take care of each other and ourselves now over the next couple of years, the next 5, 6, 8, 10 years, with this work that we're doing and how we organize it, I think it's going to be important, not just to coastal erosion, but to all these disciplines, and then also to the communication of them through our communities and through our institutions and through the agencies and so forth. So again, I apologize that I get a little meta on that, but I think there's something really critical to being willing to face some of the discomfort with some of these conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Rain.
Yeah, one of my big takeaways from those meetings was that being okay with discomfort, as it is challenging to bridge disciplines, but even more so bridge cultures. And so I think that is definitely a takeaway, and we can go back to those notes and pull them into the comments for the next, for this public input period, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a suggestion that's on the table. So I think that's a good thing that we can provide to the biennial implementation team, the writing teams, as comments from the resilience team. So that's great. Thank you. Do people have, I guess I want to say, are there other, like there's going to be a lot of steps to really kind of making it to that that fully integrated interdisciplinary picture of what we're discussing now. And so, you know, are there specific steps that we might be able to identify, or that we can even pull out of those, you know, past discussions that are there? And you know, and I don't need to belabor it if all of this is in those past discussions. But are there specific steps that we might want to try and you know, say, we know that this aspect is being worked on right now and this aspect is being worked on. For instance, I know that there's active attempts to do or quite a few active attempts to engage Indigenous knowledge holders in, you know, assessing some of the information that's going on. There's also efforts to look at, you know, things like place names and how place names are you know, potentially reflect a historical aspect that contains this broader culture that there's resilience, that not that there's resilience, but that is a part of the culture that defines who they are, who we are, who the place is. And so I think that there's, you know, there are active elements that are, you know, taking place. Is there an effort that we might be able to think about and say, hey, we'd recommend like pulling sort of these aspects together? I don't know. I throw that out as a question, a broad question that's not even well formed. It's a half-baked, you know, pulling out of the oven still doughy question. So I'll throw that out to people. And I'll also say welcome, Liza, for being able to make it.
Hi, thank you. I'm happy to be here. It's nice to get caught up on this conversation from this perspective and being part of the Denali Commission team. So
Yeah, we're glad to have you here at the moment.
And if it's helpful, I can pull up the slides with the draft objectives on them, just because that might help kind of channel some of the ideas.
If I may, oh, Liz, actually, I was just going to ask you, Liz. Go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks. No, so my only thought, just to kind of as something to play around with and something I think about in the context, I think, of being a social scientist in a space in which I'm interacting with a lot of different people who are in the hard sciences, is thinking about kind of that bridge between data and people, and perhaps that bridge being education or training based, which is in that really nice graphic that kind of has the fanned out priority areas around the IARPC iceberg. Some of the kind of things toward the bottom, the goals, one of them is education and training. And so a thing I've been thinking about, again, a very half-baked, there it is, foundational activities, I think. So you do have the education, training, and capacity building kind of bit at the bottom. I think for me, in the context of something like coastal resilience, you know, that really, the idea of education and training of local community members so that data can be translated into action, whether, you know, regardless of the priority area concerned as it concerns a coastal resilience kind of perspective, whether that's Christine and I were in a PA4 meeting on Monday, I think, and whichever day that was, and thinking about how community members can be prepared to respond. The labor force can be prepared to respond to certain concerns, or how people can even be trained so that data, which often is kind of opaque to non-specialists, people in the communities can get that kind of preparation and training so that they can do the interpretation of that data without having to interact with, contractors or outside entities, or doing things like that. But you can think of that from multiple perspectives. So that's a thing I am thinking with. I don't quite know how that translates into further research action, but I would definitely be interested to see other people, or to talk about like what that means as people who are maybe based more on the research side, how we do that support of educational activities. I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point to bring up. Like, yeah, someone more on the research side, although very, very early in research, like I'm interested in like satellite monitoring of coasts. And yeah, I don't really, like I've seen it more from like an academic perspective, but I'd be very, interested to talk more and learn more about how do we take any satellite-based observations and put them somewhere, or have them framed in a way that they can easily be used for community adaptation. And that's not really something I think we talk about as much as we should in like academic institutions, but it's something I would really like to talk about, like how to bridge that gap.
Well, there is something incredibly practical, whether you're a scientist or in the humanities, about remote sensing. And if you consider what it is that you're working with to be very distanced from you, then how you frame your questions, how you expect it to have a relationship with you back is different. And so for those in, not immediately with their phenomena, something like coastal erosion is about, the coast, but it's also about the people and about food sovereignty, and it's about the dynamics of transportation. It's about so much more, and those relationships and those relational contexts I have found with those in the hard scientists, those aren't exactly things that are rewarded in the years of education and in going for grants and stuff. So just simply the compassion to feel like those things are legitimate, to understand things as relationships, not just as the phenomena to be studied. The concept of remote sensing can be very different even when somebody's in the village, much less using a satellite.
But on the idea of training, I mean, maybe there's actions or deliverables that can be specifically, focused on doing training so that it's not always the hard science that's coming in to do it, but rather, kind of pulling in people from the villages, to help interpret, and what is like interpret what this actually means. Like it's not just we're losing this point, but this is the point where we used to hunt walrus or seals from, and so when that point is lost, that's a cultural loss that we're seeing. And it's not just this, oh well, the shoreline moved back 100 feet or whatever that is. So maybe that's a consideration that we could put in as a suggestion. And I do want to say that we sent out we did send out. So I look at the time and go, oh my word, we're already closing in on the amount of time that we have available, and I don't want to lose thoughts that could potentially be really valuable. And so we have the form, which isn't nearly as easy as a discussion, but we have a form that people can write and add into. So definitely, if you're not saying something here, say it in that form and pass it on so that we can move that forward. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a great that's a great sort of, I think easily, not I should never say easily. That's a great tangible thing that we can say is this is, you know, pulling in and doing training and sitting down on this, and it's specifically related to erosion, and even erosion around a village, but not just around a village, but, you know, kind of more broadly, would be a good thing. So yeah, thanks for that. That's a great suggestion. I think about some of the work that there's some of these larger efforts, like the monitoring efforts that are being done, whether it's through ELOCA or some of those kinds of groups, or even through like the larger like biodiversity monitoring programs that are out there that are specifically trying to bring Indigenous knowledge into onto equal footing, so that it's not a heavily weighted like, well, the scientists say this and Indigenous knowledge brings us here, and maybe there's a tangible effort that moves forward that says, yeah, we've been incorporating, and over the course of the next couple of years we continue to incorporate the interpretation of information together, like jointly. And so maybe there's a, you know, collaborative efforts that are established collectively that aren't, you know, weighted one way or the other, but that, you know, everyone's sitting at that table, that we can focus efforts on trying to get to have happen. I don't know, something like that could work really well. I know there are people that want to make that happen. There's people that have been trying to make that happen, and continued efforts down that road would be probably really good.
Well, certainly you need to have the local people at the table, right? What I find when I have meetings with local folks is their perspective is just really different from what an academic's perspective would be. So it's critical to have them be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Tom, should you introduce yourself? We went around at the top to introduce ourselves. So nice to see you.
Well, yeah, sorry. So I'm Tom Ravens. I'm a professor of civil engineering, really coastal engineering at the University of Alaska Anchorage, working with a number of coastal communities in Alaska, dealing with coastal resilience issues, flooding, erosion, etc. And actually trying to come up with solutions, you know, how to address flooding, how to address erosion, what are the tools that are available to us to actually counter these threats.
So along those lines, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. And hi, Tom. It's been a while, but we met a couple of years ago when I was at the Corps of Engineers. The Denali Commission is looking to potentially put together for lack of a better word, a forum. We're thinking of like a 4 to 8 hour, you know, possibly a whole day seminar regarding, you know, both nature-based solutions and non-nature-based solutions. So we're talking about the green with the gray, looking to see, you know, looking to bring folks in from communities that have been on the ground and battling erosion, you know, threats of erosion, and some of that catastrophic, you know, combination, the oostic of, you know, the permafrost thaw with the erosion, and then flooding and those massive, you know, chunks of land, you know, falling along the coastline, et cetera. And so I just wanted to like bring that up, that we are, you know, in infant stages, but looking for lessons learned, you know, what has been done, what has worked, what hasn't worked, you know, bringing both community members that have been on the ground battling these types of issues, along with the engineers across the state that have been working on things. So keep that in mind. If you have any, you know, speakers or, you know, thoughts on agenda or invitees, things like that.
Well, that's great. And that's also a great introduction to next month's topic, because we're going to have Sophia from Shaktoolik, who's going to talk about their sand and driftwood berm that they've been developing for coastal protection. And then we're also going to have Walter from Napakiak talking about river erosion and how the community is sort of responding to that and planning for that. So that's a little bit like a preview of what you have in mind, I think.
Yes, and we've been working with both of those communities. We have active grants. We helped with the funding of the design for Shaktoolik's soft erosion protection berm. It's like a sacrificial berm that requires yearly maintenance. But those are two great examples, and I'm glad that you have them there. Walter and Sophia are wonderful.
We are starting to get a little short on time at this point, but I do want to throw it open. Are there other thoughts or ideas or things that people might want to just bring up, even just bring up, just so that we can, have those out on the table, even if it's discussions that we want to have in the future that we might, think about organizing one of these coastal resilience discussions around. So happy to listen to ideas.
Hi, yeah, this is Su Guang. I'm also, as I introduce myself, also from civil engineering. So what I'm thinking is, so right now we try to protect the coast, right? What happened if we couldn't? What happened? And what's the solution for? What's the next? What should we do next? And then how can we deal with the community? How can we deal with the like an ecosystem, something like that. So I think that's, as a civil engineer, we try to bring up a lot of try to solve the problem, and then what's happening if we couldn't. So that's, I think, something we probably need to bring up for the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Say Taze.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, thanks. I'm Martin Ash. I'm over at the Institute of Natural Resources and Extension at UAF. So we're faculty who take the research and more or less chew it up, digest it, and go to the public with it, and then get really information from the public of what they're really interested in, take it back to the researchers, kind of a bridge more or less with the academic faculty and the research faculty. I'm wondering if anybody has been on these calls or currently is, that's with the Marine Advisory Program. That's the similar. I'm on the ag side, so I'm out of the land grant. So I'm mostly teaching things that have to do with the land. But the Marine Advisory folks do the exact same job as faculty, but they do it through funding from NOAA. Has anybody from the Marine Advisory Program at UAF who primarily do outreach, have they been a part of any of these meetings?
Not that I'm aware of, but if you have a link that you could drop in,
All right.
some more information about who's involved in that would be great.
Okay, because they take a look at some of the topics that you're running over, as well as climate migration. If the seawalls won't work and such, what's the process of relocating, more or less, and look at a lot of coastal resiliency topics. So David and other people over there, that's kind of their forte. So I'll go ahead and put the information in the chat box. Thank you.
I know that Gay Sheffield, who I think is involved in that program, has been involved in a lot of different IARPC groups over time.
Yeah, she's the one that comes to mind the most in terms of ones that I know directly who've been involved in the past. But but it does bring up another, I know there was a whole handful of discussions that took place that was kind of a combination with Sea Grant extension and some of the, back when they still existed, the LCCs looking at coastal resilience, and they had meetings that took place in like Kotzebue, Nome, I think down in, I want to say, they did one in Kodiak, they did one in Unalaska, they did one in, anyway, King Salmon maybe. And so they kind of were hitting different coastal areas, trying to really get at bringing the community in and having meetings. And there was a whole bunch of information that came from those meetings that I think that's all on Adapt Alaska. There's an Adapt Alaska website, and a lot of information came out of those coastal resilience meetings that's now kind of housed in that Adapt Alaska. And I know that those were multi-day meetings with the villages and representatives coming in to discuss their concerns in relation to everything from energy to fisheries. I mean, there was a broad set of discussions that took place. And so there's a lot of information that's housed there. And so I know that to some degree, coastal resilience is, absolutely been looked at over time. And so we can kind of go back and look at some of those and see what they, what's sitting there now. So I'll just put it that way, and what's changed and what's moved forward. So
along those same lines, the Division of Geological and Geophysical Services has, they've been uploading vulnerability assessments to their adaptation tracking tool or vulnerability assessment tracking tool that I can provide to the group as well.
Yeah, that would be good. I think Jackie Overbeck is the one in charge of that. And
yes.
So, yeah. All right. Well, I want to be super respectful of people's time, and we're kind of at our hour right now. So I really do thank you all for the fantastic participation that we've had today, and the good discussion. And there's a lot more to discuss in a lot of other areas. And so next week we'll be having a discussion specifically focused on coastal erosion, and as Tom brought up a little bit earlier, and what's being done in some areas to address that. And so join us next time. I think it'll be a great discussion. And I see several links that are going into the chat right now. So grab those links before we close the meeting and they disappear, and take a look at that information that's there. In the meantime, if there are any ideas, more ideas, by all means, feel free to send them into the form that we put in. And I know that form is linked in one of these links that was put up in the chat. So please do submit your ideas, especially for the implementation plan. Those ideas are due by the end of the month. So we have until the end of the month to get those in for those transition teams. And we're glad to have you all here. Glad to be a part of one of the co-leads here. It's a great team, and I'm happy to be a part of it. And so thank you for showing up. And I don't have anything else. So if no one else, I'll give you 30 seconds to bring up one last thing if you have to. But otherwise, I'll adjourn the meeting and say thank you to everyone for participation.